Social infrastructure, a term we're going to be hearing more and more of, and should we worry about that? Ian Lee is with us now, Associate Prof at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University. Ian, great to have you with us. It caught my ear, I'll be right up front. I am one of those pedantic people who doesn't like invented new terms. But in this case, there's actually a serious reason to be fearful of the term social infrastructure, and that is that it is a mislabel that then allows you to get away with some stuff.
That's exactly my view. I mean, the very phrase social infrastructure is an oxymoron. I mean by that, the spending that Ms. Freeland was referring to, Minister Freeland was referring to, and I was in the virtual lockup for the entire 8 hours. I did read it very carefully. And what they're doing is they're trying to normalize social expenditures by classifying it as something else that they see as that has a greater cachet, a greater support. And I'm not suggesting that social spending isn't important. Of course it is. Spending on unemployment insurance, old age pensions, university, higher education is important too. But to say that an annual expenditure is now an investment. I mean, investments by definition are unusual. They're typically CapEx in the language, the jargon of accounting. It's a capital expenditure. It's like spending $1 billion or $5 billion to build a plant. You don't spend it every year. And so they're mislabeling it by suggesting it's investment when it's social annual spending. And they mislabel it a second time by characterizing it as infrastructure when it most certainly isn't. I mean, infrastructure has been studied literally all the way back to the time of Adam Smith. And the reason it has attracted so much attention is people realize, not just economists, people realize infrastructure is that which speeds up the movement of goods, services, people in the economy and thereby enhances the productive capacity of the economy. Daycare centers are noble, but that is not infrastructure.
Well, so I would challenge you on that a little bit. I agree that once you let this term out of the barn, it does seem to take over the field. So you do have things like the worker benefit and other forms of straight up social spending being labeled social infrastructure. Could you make the case that if we're to think of infrastructure and modern infrastructure, it evolves as something that is cross-economy, facilitating growth, a benefit to the greater good, even if it doesn't apply to the individual? You could make the case, could you not, that something like a universal program, not unlike healthcare, could be a form of economic infrastructure, or is that a stretch that'll sprain something?
I'll put forward the argument to you, and I think it's a good argument. It's been made, but I don't agree with it. And what that argument is doing is confusing externalities. I mean, we all know about pollution as an externality and carbon taxes, and everybody is, I think, started to think that an externality is only a negative externality. But there's positive externalities, as economists have noted. Higher education period, is a positive externality because not only does the individual being educated become more employable, they make more money, etc., but it produces a more educated workforce, and that allows the economy to grow more rapidly and move up the value-added curve. So to your argument, I think, is really an argument for pointing out the very beneficial, positive externalities of, e.g., universal daycare, or childcare, I should say. But it is not an infrastructure argument. And I know we may seem like we're just debating words, but I think they have a meaning. I mean, pipelines, airports, railroads. I mean, people understand. Yeah, I'm moving stuff from Vancouver to Toronto, and that's clearly infrastructure, whereas pipelines are. But this is a positive externality from education writ large.
Okay, and to your point, we are not debating, it's not the point of this conversation, the merits of the spending. We could,
That's right.
But we won't. The government has outlined spending. It's the government's job to do that. Social spending is a big part of that. When you call something infrastructure, you can justify economically, Econ 101, financing it with debt. And our government plans to do that with more and more long-term debt. And I think this is where my eyebrows went up, is we're going to be, when you run a deficit, you're financing current operations with future debt. It makes sense for a road. It doesn't make sense for healthcare that's going to be used tomorrow. So what kind of trouble do we get into when we let this rebrand happen and social programs are labeled infrastructure with 50-year bonds?
You're absolutely right, and I know economists don't like this, and with the greatest respect to academic economists who mostly have not worked out in the business world, they maybe don't see the parallels. They don't like the household being compared to government, but there are distinctions. We understand as individuals, you borrow to buy a house because it's a very large ticket item, $500,000, $1 million, $2 million if you're in the GTA, and you just don't carry that money around in your back pocket if you're an ordinary Canadian. And so you finance that. But I think most Canadians understand intuitively you shouldn't be financing your grocery bills each week on your Visa bill. If you can't pay them, you've got a very serious sustainability problem. So it's the distinction between you finance long-term debts and use long-term debt against a long-term asset, such as a bridge, a road, an airport, a pipeline, and so forth. When you say that annual expenditures, which is what Ms. Freeland is saying, annual expenditures are really an investment, so therefore, and interest rates are low, she says, so let's go out and borrow. I think that that's a very bad argument for borrowing to finance annual operating expenditures, which we typically call consumption. In the world of households and in the world of government, right, we call it annual expenditures.
Okay. Now, and then that gets us to where things stand. And of course, we've talked about this before. We seem to have lost, we collectively, our angst or concern about deficits and the amount of debt that we carry. We were looking for a fiscal anchor, Ian. We got it. It feels like an anchor around our necks at 50%, yes, 5 years from now, 49 point something 5 years from now. That's a high number. Interest rates are low. Hope they stay there. Do you worry about that level of debt?
I do, and I'm glad you brought this up because, again, I was in the virtual lockup, and I saw that comment, I think it was in an interview actually in the lockup, where Ms. Freeland said, we're in this new world, the old laws of economics don't apply. I don't buy that argument. I just do not. Right. It's like saying, well, because I'm a millennial and I'm really sensitive and progressive, therefore gravity doesn't apply to me if I fall off a ladder. Well, the laws of physics still apply. We may think differently about debt, but the idea that debt is irrelevant and doesn't matter and cannot constrain a government, or that it might run into a fiscal wall down the road, I think is bogus. Mm-hmm. The laws of what I call it, the laws, the norms, the logic of economics continues to apply, and we've doubled our vaunted very low debt to GDP ratio of 30%. We've almost doubled it in 4 years, and a lot of it was on social expenditure. Okay, I understand why we did it, but I'm saying, yeah, I guess because I think I'm a former banker, I'm saying, okay, at the end of the day, you're much deeper in debt. What have you got to show for it? Do you have another $1 trillion of productive public good assets out there? And if your answer is, yeah, but I felt really good, it's like the person who goes out to a bar one night, drinks far too much, orders far too much food, has a wonderful time, but they've got a $500 bill on their card, and there's no compensating asset against that binge at the restaurant that night. And so I guess I'm old-fashioned like that.
And they wake up with a hangover the next day. Let's not forget that part of it, which I guess gets us to, we do seem to be having a rethink about how much long-term debt is sustainable. And I guess you could use the analogy of, if you can service the mortgage on your dream home and you can service it till you die, maybe it doesn't matter that the bank really owns your house. You get to live there, you can afford it. But that thinking gets dangerous when rates spike up and you get evicted.
You do, Amanda, and I want to bring back in again this issue. I'm not so worried about the government of Canada all by itself, if it was truly the only entity in this discussion, because they do have a printing press called the Bank of Canada, and they do have tremendous borrowing capacity. My fear is that the provinces, and we know some are already insolvent. I didn't use the word bankrupt, insolvent, meaning unable to meet their bills as they become due. I'm referring to Newfoundland and Labrador. I think New Brunswick is on the edge. And in the next 2, 3, 4 years, when one or more of these governments raises their hand at a press conference and it goes out across Canada and says, look, We cannot pay our nurses. We cannot pay our doctors and our teachers. Prime Minister of the day, you've got to bail us out. That's why, I don't buy these arguments that Ms. Freeland is giving, because first off, she only very carefully quotes the federal debt to GDP when we should be looking at the total debt to GDP, because the federal government is truly the lender of last resort, as we saw in the Depression when they bailed out the government of Alberta.